I should explain what I did exactly. I wrote basically a profile of an organization, a Christian evangelical organization that partners with local law enforcement inside of South Asia and Southeast Asia in order to initiate what's colloquially called brothel raids, or basically police interventions to remove trafficking victims and prosecute their traffickers. It seems like a noteworthy and laudable practice, and indeed it has definitely helped some trafficking victims. However, there's a certain amount of collateral damage and fallout from these operations that can occur. And basically I was writing about the ways in which trafficking victims and their would-be rescuers were misunderstanding each other, often to rather complicated results. And that would result in the development of policies and practices that were little informed by the experiences and voices of trafficking victims themselves. So, basically I talked about the evolution of this organization's practices, I think for the better. And, but mostly I began to interrogate the ways in which counter-trafficking efforts became an extension of unspoken state mandates. So the ways in which shelters could become a way to clean streets or rehabilitate the unsightly, and the ways in which people were convinced of their freedom of movement by being detained within shelters, and they were being rehabilitated through forced psychosocial services. So basically I've been a kind of critic of counter-trafficking efforts, but I definitely have seen a number of good practices and really noteworthy practices as well, which is going to be some of the focus of my upcoming research.
And we're going to open questions from you all in just 1 minute. Let me just get back to Noy for a second. While you were doing your research, what was the biggest problem, and what advice would you have for another journalist going into the same kind of work?
Basically, as Mike was talking about, access to people who would tell their stories was a significant issue, as was the profound lack of data or prevalence of very ideologically skewed data or data highly questionable methodology behind the procurement of said data. And I guess I would urge journalists to consider what Mike and Ben have said about doing no harm, but I actually think we can go quite a bit further. As I was conducting some of my research and working with social service providers, I became kind of interested in the way that I felt that journalism itself could be what I call an extractive industry, which we mine the psyches of the traumatized for what? Salacious details, or details to provide a sense of self-righteousness in a viewer or a reader, and that is just not good enough for me. I became kind of interested in the way that perhaps journalists could be more victim-centered in their approaches, and to write stories in which the three-dimensionality of a person could be there for other readers to see. And so I would urge reporters to not only think about the moment of dramatic epiphany of rescue and raid and rehabilitation, but to think of what happens in life happily ever after. What is that all about? And what has brought people to these shores or in the exploitative environments that they're in? I guess it's a story not only of the deprivation and exploitation, but of resilience. And I would also urge reporters to start looking at stories that are in their backyards. This is not just stories of exploitation of innocent village girls in countries far away. It's the story of who's picking our tomatoes, who's making our clothes, and the kind of anxiety that can result in employing someone or exploiting them to care for our children or clean our homes at the expense of their own children and their own homes.
Sound advice indeed. I would add, before I give you a chance, Ben, that I hope a lot of editors would get the same advice, because I think it's one thing for a reporter to be out there, and it's another to come in and say to your editor, I've got this story, and then you get the answer, gee, we've done trafficking, as if one story covers it all. So I think when you all make your handbook of how-tos, I think it needs to go to the editors as well as to. One more from Ben, and then we're going to the audience.
Sure. Very briefly, I just wanted to I just wanted to endorse what Noy was saying there. It's, I very quickly learned if you do a 2-minute interview with somebody who's been through great trauma, you're, in many cases, whether or not you're protecting their identity after the fact, you're doing more harm than good, just because you're dealing with them in the isolate, you're freezing them as a victim. And near the end of the 5-year process of writing this book, I began to realize that most of the people that I was talking to were not victims, they were survivors. And it's a very, very critical distinction that they get out, however they get out, and however their process of survival is going, they are survivors, and we need to respect that process.
Bravo. Let's open it up to the audience for some questions, and if you want to, please identify yourself, and if you want to direct it to somebody, go ahead. Otherwise, we'll see who feels like a victim and wants to take the question. Questions? Yes, sir.
Thank you. Chairman, United Nations Public-Private Alliance for Rural Development. Question is, been in many meetings in this House about human trafficking, and one question I still haven't heard much of an answer to is, are we being nibbled to death by minnows, or are there big fish? And if there are big fish, why are there no stories about big fish? Thank you.
By big fish, I assume you mean the people responsible,
Exactly.
the criminals. Do you want to take that, Mr. Secretary?
Well, actually, I will, later on, in a closing statement, I will address some of the points implicitly raised by this question. There are big fish, perhaps not as big as one would think, not in terms of a single organization being involved in organizing the trafficking into a given country. Could be the US, could be any European country or anywhere else. Obviously, there are organized crime interests, a ramification, more in terms of facilitating, not the transaction, but the trade-off, the transportation of, if you wish, the recruitment at origin through agencies and whatever other instruments is used to profit from the vulnerability of the victims. The point you're raising, though, is well taken. The ambassador, Silebaka, mentioned certain number of victims rescued last year. I think his number is a bit generous. He said 45,000. We came out a few months ago with about half that amount. Although we do not know how big the problem is, the amount of victims rescued, probably in the 20,000 or so, would be about 2% of the sea of victims. So that would mean that we are only able to save about a fraction of the victims. But then if you look at another set of statistics, the number of people who have actually been nailed, namely arrested and then prosecuted and then convicted, you get in numbers that can fit on my hand for major countries, 3, 4, 5 in many European countries, which indeed kind of give origin to the sort of perplexity you have. Are there big fish? Are we only getting the little ones? I think that the picture is very complicated. Certainly there is, to repeat, there are mafia sort of syndicate organization, but the retailing is done by kind of local crime figures. Many of them arrested, but we are just at the beginning of the process, I think.
Of any of the panel, Mike, have you dealt with some of the big fish?
Well, we believe that the Kansas City case represents one of the bigger fish ever brought down, this group of a dozen traffickers. But you got to remember what a difficult crime this is to prosecute. The victims do not want to come forward. They've been told their families back home can be killed. They've been told they can be killed. This is a very difficult crime to prosecute. And even under the best of laws, it's difficult to prosecute. And what we're seeing in the U.S., and our stories was mainly about the problems in prosecuting it in the U.S., we have cases where a lot of traffickers go down for things like harboring because they can't make that next step and show them to be traffickers. So instead of getting a 20-year sentence, they may get a 5-year sentence. They're being prosecuted, but not for the crime they committed in many cases.
So what you're saying is it's not a journalism problem as much as it's a law enforcement problem.
I believe so.